August 17, 1943, 24,000 feet above the industrial hub of Schweinfurt, Germany. The air is -50 degrees Fahrenheit, thin enough to freeze the condensation from a man's breath into a solid sheet of ice. A Luftwaffe pilot, tightly strapped into the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, breaks through a dense layer of cirrus clouds. He banks his fighter, expecting to find the scattered remnants of a retreating enemy. Instead, he stares into an impossibility, stretching across the Kyungo. Horizon is a massive miles-long armada of heavy bombers. They are American B-17 flying fortresses, flying in tight, staggered combat boxes, hundreds of them. The sunlight glints harshly off their aluminum skin, their 4 radial engines leaving thick, intersecting contrails that scar the deep blue stratosphere. The air is already choked with the black, greasy puffs of anti-aircraft flak, yet the formation does not flinch. They do not scatter. Despite horrifying losses taken just miles prior, the bomber stream presses relentlessly eastward, deeper into the Reich. For the German defenders, a chilling realization begins to take hold. These invaders are not just surviving, but actively reshaping the nature of the war in the skies. By mid-1942, the European continent lay securely under the iron grip of the Third Reich, from the coastal fortifications of occupied France to the expansive Russian steppes. The German war machine appeared unassailable. For the Allies, the only immediate avenue to strike at the industrial heart of the Nazi Empire was from the sky. However, the method of delivering that destruction sparked a profound and fundamental disagreement between 2 Allied nations. British Royal Air Force, having bled heavily in the early, desperate years of the conflict, had adopted a brutal but pragmatic doctrine: nighttime area bombing. Under the rigid command of Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the RAF sent vast streams of heavy bombers under the protective cloak of darkness. Their mission was to blanket German industrial centers with high explosives and incendiaries. Precision was virtually impossible in the pitch black of a European night. The objective was simply to dehouse the workforce, cripple civil infrastructure, and shatter the enemy's will to fight. It was a blunt, terrifying instrument of mass attrition. Then, the Americans arrived, bringing a radically different philosophy born in the clear, sunlit skies of the American Southwest. The United States Army Air Forces committed wholly to the doctrine of unescorted, daylight precision bombing. The concept relied heavily on a highly classified technological marvel, the Norden bombsight. This complex analog computer, utilizing gyroscopes and mechanical calculators, was supposedly accurate enough to calculate wind drift and airspeed to drop a payload onto a specific factory roof from 20,000 feet. USAF commanders argued that surgically destroying specific industrial choke points, such as ball-bearing plants, synthetic oil refineries, and aircraft assembly lines would paralyze the German war machine far more efficiently than blindly leveling entire city blocks. To execute this ambitious doctrine, the United States military began assembling the mighty 8th Air Force. The quiet, pastoral landscape of East Anglia, in eastern England, was rapidly transformed into an immense, unsinkable aircraft carrier. Endless miles of concrete runways sliced through ancient farmlands, burying centuries of quiet agriculture under millions of tons of aggregate. Corrugated iron Nissen huts sprouted like metallic forests in the perpetual British drizzle. Tens of thousands of young American airmen poured into these muddy, sprawling bases, bringing with them a potent mix of untested optimism and the overwhelming weight of American industrial muscle. At the absolute center of this grand strategic vision was the machine itself, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 was a 4-engine Leviathan of aluminum and steel, famously rugged and bristling with up to 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns. The prevailing American military theory, fiercely championed by air power advocates for a decade prior, dictated that a heavily armed bomber formation did not need the protection of agile fighter escorts. This self-defending concept was meticulously formalized into a tactical structure known as the combat box. Formations of 18 to 21 bombers were arranged in a staggered, three-dimensional grid, strictly organized into high lead and low squadrons. This overlapping geometry was explicitly designed to create an impenetrable dome of defensive crossfire. The theory promised that any enemy interceptor daring to approach would be instantly met by a mathematically overwhelming wall of armor-piercing tracer rounds. It was a doctrine rooted entirely in combined firepower and mutual protection. The top brass of the 8th Air Force possessed an unshakable, almost religious faith in this system. They believed the heavy bomber was the ultimate, unstoppable weapon of the modern age. They believed their vast armadas could punch through any defensive perimeter, strike their targets with pinpoint accuracy, and fight their way back home across the English Channel. But theories drafted on clean chalkboards in Washington and London had yet to be tested against the brutal realities of the European theater, where a deeply entrenched and highly sophisticated enemy awaited. Across the English Channel, the architects of the Third Reich had not been idle. The skies over occupied Europe were defended by the most sophisticated, deeply integrated anti-aircraft network the world had ever seen. The Americans were about to fly directly into a meticulously engineered meat grinder. The foundation of this defensive shield was an invisible web of electronic surveillance known as the Kamm-Huber line, named after its creator, General Joseph Kamm-Huber. It was a sprawling, multi-layered system of early warning radar stretching from Denmark down through the Netherlands, Belgium, and central France. Giant Fray radar dishes swept the horizon unceasingly, detecting incoming bomber streams hundreds of miles away while they were still forming up over English fields. Once the targets drew closer, the highly precise Wurzburg radar systems took over. These dishes fed exact altitude, speed, and heading data to underground command bunkers. Here, Luftwaffe controllers moved markers across massive glass maps, orchestrating the defense with chilling efficiency. The element of surprise, essential to the American doctrine, was stripped away before the bombers even reached the European coastline, waiting on the ground below. The predicted bomber flight paths were the formidable flak batteries. Over 1 million men, women, and teenagers operated thousands of anti-aircraft guns, most notably the dreaded 88mm Flak 36. These weapons hurled 20-pound, high-explosive shells 5 miles into the upper atmosphere. The resulting explosions filled the sky with jagged, white-hot shrapnel. There was no evasive maneuvering through a flak field. The American bombers simply had to fly straight and level to give the Norden bombsight its necessary data. They were forced to stoically absorb the punishment as the sky around them turned into a boiling cauldron of black smoke, turbulent air, and deafening concussions that could tear an aircraft in half. But the flak, as terrifying as it was, acted merely as the anvil. The hammer belonged to the Jagdwaffe, the Luftwaffe's elite fighter force, the German pilots. Waiting in readiness on grass airfields across the continent were battle-hardened veterans. Many had cut their teeth in the relentless swirling dogfights of the Battle of Britain, or had racked up staggering kill counts against the Soviet Air Force on the brutal Eastern Front. They were apex predators, flying 2 of the most lethal interceptors of the war: the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the formidable Focke-Wulf 190. The FW 190, widely known as the Butcher Bird, was specifically armed to tear heavy bombers apart. It was equipped with 4 20mm autocannons. A single explosive shell from these weapons could rip the wing off a flying fortress, and a focused burst could disintegrate a cockpit. The fatal flaw in the American strategy quickly became brutally apparent as the bomber streams pushed deeper into the continent. The 8th Air Force did possess fighter escorts agile, British Spitfires and heavy American P-47 Thunderbolts. However, these fighters were severely limited by their internal fuel capacity. They could escort the bombers across the Channel and perhaps as far as the western edges of Germany. But then, the fuel gauges would drop toward empty. The escort pilots would wag their wings in a grim farewell and turn back toward the safety of England. This left the heavy bombers entirely exposed. For hundreds of miles, deep into the heart of the Reich and back again, the B-17s had to rely solely on their interlocking machine gun fire. The German controllers on the ground watched the radar screens, waiting for the exact moment the Allied fighters turned for home. Once the bomber stream was isolated beyond the range of escort, the Jagdwaffe swarmed. The mathematics of the ensuing battles were terrifying and unsustainable for the attackers. A bomber crew had to complete 25 missions to finish a combat, tour and earn a ticket home. Yet, during the deep unescorted raids of 1943, the statistical life expectancy of an 8th Air Force crewman was roughly 11 missions. They were fighting a war of attrition where the calculus of survival offered virtually no hope of victory. The grand American doctrine was about to collide with the uncompromising reality of aerial slaughter, forcing the men inside those aluminum tubes to confront the absolute limits of human endurance. To understand the 8th Air Force's war is to understand an environment entirely hostile to human life. At 25,000 feet, the stratosphere is a frozen, oxygen-starved void. The B-17 Flying Fortress, for all its armor and firepower, was completely unpressurized and virtually uninsulated. The wind tore through the open waist gunner windows at over 150 miles per hour. Inside the thin aluminum fuselage, the ambient temperature routinely plummeted to 60 degrees below zero. In this brutal ecosystem, the cold was as lethal as German Flak. To survive, airmen wore layers of thick fleece-lined leather and bulky, electrically heated flight suits. These blue suits plugged directly into the bomber's electrical grid, functioning like wearable heated blankets. But the primitive wiring was highly prone to failure. A short circuit could inflict severe electrical burns on a gunner's skin. A sudden loss of power meant instantaneous, creeping frostbite. Men lost fingers, toes, and ears to the freezing air, simply because a single delicate wire snapped during a violent evasive maneuver. Worse than the cold was the invisible threat of hypoxia. Above 10,000 feet, the atmosphere is too thin to sustain human consciousness. The 10 men aboard AB-17 were entirely tethered to the aircraft's onboard oxygen system. They breathed through heavy rubber masks strapped tightly to their faces, the condensation from their breath constantly freezing into solid blocks of ice around their microphones. If a stray piece of shrapnel severed an oxygen line, or if a flak burst shattered the central tank, a crewman had roughly 3 minutes of useful consciousness. After that, extreme lethargy would set in, followed by a quiet, euphoric slip into a coma, and finally death. Gunners had to constantly monitor their oxygen flow and check the lines of the men next to them, tapping each other on the shoulder in a grim, silent roll call amidst the chaos of combat. Operating complex machinery in these conditions required superhuman focus. The physical space inside the bomber was intensely claustrophobic. Men had to navigate narrow, vibrating catwalks over open bomb bays while wearing 60 pounds of gear, including heavy flak aprons and parachute harnesses. The noise was absolute. The deafening, synchronized roar of 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines vibrated through the floorboards, making verbal communication in the cabin impossible. The crew relied entirely on crackling, static-filled throat microphones to call out incoming fighter targets. Then came the bomb run. This was the technological and psychological crux of the entire daylight doctrine. As the bomber formation approached the target city, the pilot relinquished control of the aircraft. For the final agonizing minutes of the approach, the bombardier, crouched in the plexiglass nose, took over. He looked through the optics of the highly classified Norden bombsight. This analog mechanical computer was linked directly to the bomber's autopilot system. To calculate the precise drop trajectory, accounting for altitude, airspeed, and wind drift, the bomber had to be flown absolutely straight and perfectly level. No evasive action was permitted. For the pilot and co-pilot, gripping the yokes with white knuckles, this was the ultimate test of nerve. They had to hold the massive aircraft perfectly steady, while anti-aircraft shells detonated in a tight black box around them. They watched sheets of jagged shrapnel tear through the sky directly in their flight path, knowing they could not turn away. They could smell the acrid stench of cordite bleeding into the unsealed cabin, mixing rapidly with the smell of spilled hydraulic fluid, sweat, and fear. The psychological toll of this existence was devastating. 10 young men, mostly in their late teens and early 20s, were sealed inside an aluminum tube and sent repeatedly into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. They watched their friends die in neighboring aircraft. They saw perfectly healthy B-17s suddenly erupt into spectacular fireballs, disintegrating into falling debris with no parachutes emerging. They returned to base to find empty bunks in their Nissen huts, quietly packing up the personal effects of men they had shared breakfast with just hours earlier. The sheer statistical impossibility of completing a 25-mission combat tour weighed heavily on every single crew member. Each morning, they woke in the freezing dark, ate powdered eggs, and attended grim briefings where a red ribbon on a map stretched hundreds of miles across hostile territory. They were asked to overcome a profound primal terror, relying only on their training, their machines, and the men sitting beside them. Yet, as daunting as their task was, the enemy rising to meet them was constantly evolving, engineering new and terrifying tactical maneuvers to shatter the American formations. For the veteran pilots of the Luftwaffe, the American combat box presented a lethal three-dimensional puzzle. Initially, German interceptors relied on the standard pursuit curve, dropping in behind the bomber formations to attack from the rear. It was a catastrophic mistake. Approaching a squadron of flying fortresses from the 6 o'clock position meant flying directly into a concentrated wall of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The interlocking fields of fire from the tail, ball turret, waist, and top turret gunners created a defensive net that shredded the lighter German fighters before they could even get into effective cannon range. A new tactic was desperately required. The solution came from frontline commanders like Egan Meyer. Executing a frontal assault was an act of extreme psychological and physical discipline. A Focke-Wulf 190 and a B-17, flying directly at one another, generated a combined closing speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. The German pilot had to perfectly align his fighter miles ahead of the bomber stream, throttle forward, and stare down the plexiglass nose of an incoming 25-ton Leviathan. At that velocity, the engagement window was terrifyingly brief. The pilot had barely 3 seconds to aim, squeeze the firing button to unleash a burst of 20mm cannon fire, and immediately violently push the stick forward to dive beneath the bomber. A fraction of a second of hesitation meant a catastrophic mid-air collision, showering the sky with the burning wreckage of both aircraft. To increase their lethality without entering the lethal range of the defensive crossfire, the Luftwaffe began bolting heavy artillery to their nimble fighters. Twin-engine heavy fighters, known as Zersterer or destroyers, were equipped with Werfer Granat 21 rockets. These massive 210mm mortar tubes were slung under the wings. They were inaccurate, but precision was not the goal. The rockets were fired en masse into the center of the American combat box, set with time delay fuses. The sheer concussive force of an 80-pound explosive warhead detonating in the middle of a formation was enough to flip a bomber entirely upside down, shattering the strict geometric discipline of the box. Once the formation was broken, the slaughter began. A B-17 that fell out of the protective umbrella of the combat box became a straggler. Stripped of its overlapping cover, it was immediately hunted down. Packs of German fighters would swarm the isolated bomber, methodically targeting the inboard engines or raking the cockpit until the battered aircraft finally spiraled out of control toward the German countryside. Tactically, the German defenders were achieving spectacular success. During the summer and early autumn of 1943, Luftwaffe aces were returning to their airfields with staggering kill counts. They would land their soot-stained fighters, physically drained and drenched in sweat, having torn entire American squadrons out of the sky. For the German High Command, the mathematics of the air war seemed to be tipping decisively in their favor. By inflicting unsustainable losses, often destroying 10 to 15% of the attacking American force in a single afternoon, they believed they were breaking the back of the 8th Air Force. The logic of traditional warfare dictated that no military force could absorb such punishing casualty rates without collapsing. But this was not traditional warfare. It was an industrial war of annihilation. The psychological toll on the German pilots began to mount as a chilling realization took hold. They would fight a grueling, bloody battle, shooting down dozens of heavy bombers and exhausting their ammunition, fuel, and adrenaline. They would go to sleep believing they had crippled the enemy's capacity to strike. Yet, the very next morning, or as soon as the weather cleared, the early warning radar arrays along the coast would light up again. The reports from the command bunkers were maddening. Another massive blip was forming over East Anglia. Another 500 bombers. Another thousands of men. The sky would fill once more with the exact same relentless geometric formations, droning eastward as if the previous day's massacre had never happened. The Axis pilots found themselves trapped in a Sisyphean nightmare, fighting an enemy backed by a seemingly infinite reservoir of industrial production and human replacement. They were slowly being crushed under the sheer, unyielding weight of American logistics. This grim cycle of slaughter and stubborn return was about to culminate in a single, catastrophic afternoon that would push both sides to the absolute brink of destruction. October 14, 1943. The briefing rooms across East Anglia fall dead silent. The canvas sheet is pulled back from the main map, revealing a stark red ribbon stretching deep into Bavaria. The target is Schweinfurt. The objective is the sprawling complex of ball-bearing factories, the friction-reducing lifeblood of the German mechanized war machine. The men of the 8th Air Force know this name intimately. They had bled terribly over this exact airspace just 2 months prior. Now, against all logic of survival, they are being ordered back into the furnace. At 10:15 a.m., the first of 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses heave themselves off the damp English runways. They slowly assemble into their massive combat boxes over the coast, a droning aluminum armada carrying nearly 3,000 American airmen. For the first few hundred miles, they are shielded by P-47 Thunderbolt escorts. But as the bomber stream crosses the German border near Aachen, the fighters hit the uncompromising limit of their internal fuel tanks. The Thunderbolts wag their wings and bank away toward the Channel. The heavy bombers are now utterly alone. Below them, the German radar grid has been tracking their trajectory since they left England. General Adolf Galland, the brilliant commander of the German fighter arm, has marshaled every available interceptor in Western Europe. Over 300 battle-hardened German fighters rise to meet the unescorted stream. What follows is not a conventional battle, but a sustained, mechanized slaughter. The attacks begin precisely at 1:04 p.m. Twin-engine Messerschmitt, Bf-110s and Junkers, Ru-88s hover safely out of range of the .50 caliber machine guns. They lob heavy time-fused rockets directly into the tight American formations. The resulting 80-pound explosions violently flip 25-ton bombers onto their backs, tearing gaping holes in the defensive boxes. Instantly, single-engine Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s pour through the shattered gaps. They attack in merciless waves of 20 or 30, slashing through the bomber stream from all angles. The sky over Germany becomes a surreal, terrifying canvas of industrial destruction. Burning debris, discarded external drop tanks, and hundreds of white parachutes litter the freezing airspace. Inside the bombers, crews fight a desperate, losing battle for survival. Gunners slip on frozen blood and a carpet of spent brass casings, firing their weapons until the barrels literally melt and warp. The interphone frequencies are overwhelmed with the chaotic, overlapping screams of men calling out fighter positions, mixed with the chilling, abrupt silence of aircraft suddenly vanishing into expanding fireballs. When a B-17 is mortally wounded, its death is agonizing to watch. Some instantly disintegrate under a direct flak hit to the bomb bay. Others fall out of formation, engines ablaze, entering a slow, unrecoverable death spiral. Neighboring crews watch helplessly, counting the parachutes that emerge from the flaming wreckage, knowing perfectly well that the same fate could find them seconds later. The unyielding barrage continues for over 3 hours. By the time the battered remnants of the strike force finally release their payloads over the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants, the American formations are unrecognizable. The return journey is a limping, agonizing retreat. Aircraft with missing engines, shredded control surfaces, and dead or dying crewmen struggle just to stay airborne over the North Sea. The final toll of Black Thursday is mathematically devastating. 60 B-17s are entirely wiped from the sky. Another 17 are so heavily damaged upon landing that they will never fly again. Furthermore, over 120 bombers require extensive major repairs. In a single afternoon, the 8th Air Force loses over 600 highly trained men. It is a casualty rate exceeding 20%, a statistical catastrophe that breaks the fundamental logic of the American bombing doctrine. No military force can sustain such hemorrhaging. In Berlin, the Nazi High Command celebrates a decisive strategic triumph. The Luftwaffe has definitively proven that the heavily armed American combat box can and will be broken if flown without escort. The staggering losses forced the United States Army Air Forces into a bitter concession. They immediately halt all deep penetration, unescorted raids into the heart of Germany. For months, the skies over the deep Reich remain entirely undisturbed by heavy bombers. The German defenders firmly believe they have won the war of attrition, convinced that the American resolve is shattered and the grand daylight bombing experiment has drowned in its own blood. But this silence is merely a tactical pause, masking a radical shift in American industrial and aeronautical strategy that is about to unleash an entirely new kind of terror upon the Jagdwaffe. The cold, gray winter of 1943 settled over Europe, bringing a deceptive quiet to the upper atmosphere. In the underground bunkers of the German command, there was a palpable sense of victory. The devastating slaughter of Black Thursday had proven their defensive doctrine. The Americans, it seemed, had finally learned the bloody lesson that the skies over the Reich were impenetrable. But across the Atlantic, the vast machinery of American industry was not pausing. It was solving the tactical equation. The solution arrived on the rain-swept runways of East Anglia in the form of an aerodynamic masterpiece, the North American P-51 Mustang. Initially designed for the British, early versions of the Mustang were fast at low altitudes, but sluggish in the freezing, thin air where the heavy bombers operated. The stroke of genius came when engineers married the sleek American airframe to the supercharged, Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, the P-51 became a high-altitude thoroughbred. More importantly, when fitted with massive external drop tanks made of compressed paper and resin, the Mustang possessed an astonishing combat radius of over 700 miles. It could take off from England, escort the B-17s all the way to Berlin, drop its tanks to dogfight at full power, and still fly home. Simultaneously, a critical shift in leadership transformed how this new weapon would be used. In January 1944, Major General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Looking at the catastrophic bomber losses, Doolittle immediately identified a fatal flaw in the standing fighter doctrine. Previously, American escort pilots were strictly ordered to stay tethered to the bombers, forming a close defensive shield. They were entirely reactive, waiting for the Germans to strike first. Doolittle stripped away these defensive constraints. He issued a new, ruthlessly simple directive. The primary objective of the fighter force was no longer to protect the bombers, but to hunt and destroy the Luftwaffe. The massive streams of flying fortresses were no longer just a strike force. They had become the bait. In the third week of February 1944, the relentless winter overcast finally broke. The 8th Air Force unleashed Operation Argument, a massive 6-day maximum effort that history would forever remember as Big Week. Thousands of heavy bombers roared off English runways, forming a mechanized river of aluminum aimed squarely at the heart of the German aircraft manufacturing industry. Below them, the Könhuber Line radars lit up. The sirens wailed across German air bases. Veteran Jagdwaffe pilots strapped into their heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, they climbed through the freezing cloud layers, anticipating the familiar, brutal routine. Wait until the short-ranged American fighters turned back, then move in to systematically butcher the unprotected bomber boxes. But as the German interceptors leveled off at 25,000 feet, deep inside their own borders, the tactical reality of the war violently inverted. The sky above them suddenly splintered. Dropping out of the blinding high-altitude sun were hundreds of silver fighters. The German pilots stared through their plexiglass canopies in absolute disbelief. These were not twin-engine destroyers or lumbering bombers. These were single-engine American pursuit planes, operating hundreds of miles beyond their supposed physical limits. The shock was total. The heavily armed German interceptors, weighed down by thick armor glass and the massive underwing mortar tubes, designed to break bomber formations, were suddenly forced into desperate, swirling dogfights against the most lethal, agile fighters in the world. The unchained Mustang pilots fell upon the Jagdwaffe with ferocious aggression. The airspace over Germany instantly transformed from a bomber slaughterhouse into a sprawling, chaotic fighter sweep. German planes were pursued relentlessly. If a Luftwaffe pilot dove toward the deck to escape, a Mustang simply followed him down, matching him maneuver for maneuver until his aircraft was shredded by .50 caliber tracers. During the 6 days of Big Week, the 8th Air Force relentlessly pounded the industrial targets, but the true devastation was inflicted in the air. The Luftwaffe lost nearly a third of its single-engine fighter pilots in less than a week. The irreplaceable core of veteran aces men who had survived the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front was effectively vaporized. The hunters had become the hunted. For the Axis pilots who managed to parachute into their own countryside and survive, the psychological paradigm had been permanently shattered. They realized that shooting down an American bomber meant nothing. The armada would simply return the very next morning, and now it brought an apex predator with it. The absolute air supremacy of the Third Reich had been broken, setting the stage for the final grinding destruction of the German war machine. The spring of 1944 brought a fatal paradigm shift for the Third Reich. The brutal, concentrated attrition of Big Week had decisively broken the spine of the Jagdwaffe. American bomber streams no longer bled for every single mile of European airspace. Shielded by relentless swarms of long-range Mustangs, the 8th Air Force was finally free to systematically dismantle the foundational pillars of the Nazi war machine. The strategic focus now shifted from aircraft assembly plants to a target far more vulnerable and infinitely more critical: petroleum docked without fuel. A panzer division is merely thousands of tons of stationary steel. Without high-octane aviation, gas, a formidable Focke-Wulf 190 is nothing more than a grounded museum piece. General Karl Spaatz directed the full, terrifying weight of the strategic bomber arm against the sprawling synthetic oil refineries of the Ruhr Valley and the vital oil fields. Deeper in Axis territory, day after day, thousands of high-explosive bombs rained down on massive chemical complexes like Luna, shattering the intricate, highly pressurized networks of pipes and distillation towers. The results were immediate and catastrophic for the German military. The production of aviation fuel plummeted by over 90% in a matter of mere months. This created a bizarre, paralyzing paradox for the German High Command. Through the sheer, desperate organizational discipline of Armaments Minister Albert Speer, the German aviation industry actually continued to produce thousands of fighter aircraft. They moved vast assembly lines deep underground, carving factories into massive salt mines and pouring millions of tons of reinforced concrete to create bomb-proof bunkers. But the industrial miracle was entirely hollow. Freshly minted Messerschmitts rolled off subterranean assembly lines only to sit idle on camouflaged forest airstrips, towed to the runway by oxen because their fuel tanks were bone dry. The critical lack of petroleum also destroyed the Luftwaffe's capacity to replace its fallen veterans. In the triumphant years of 1941 and 1942, a German fighter pilot received over 250 hours of rigorous flight training before ever seeing combat. By the summer of 1944, a catastrophic lack of training fuel caused that number to plummet to barely 50 hours. Young, terrified German teenagers were shoved into the cockpits of high-performance interceptors, barely knowing how to take off, let alone survive a swirling dogfight against seasoned American veterans. They were slaughtered in the freezing altitudes, often shot down on their very first operational sortie by roaming packs of P-51 The absolute culmination of this relentless, suffocating campaign arrived on the gray morning of June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord. As thousands of Allied landing craft slammed into the bloody beaches of Normandy, the infantrymen carrying heavy packs looked up with primal dread. They fully expected the overcast sky to fill with the screaming dive bombers and strafing fighters that had terrorized Europe for half a decade, but the sky remained miraculously clear of the Iron Cross. Over the entire sprawling D-Day invasion front, the Luftwaffe managed to mount exactly 2 confirmed fighter sorties. The once mighty German Air Force had been entirely erased from the most important battlefield of the war. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower's bold promise to his landing troops had been kept. If you see fighting aircraft over you, they will be ours. The daylight precision bombing doctrine had finally delivered on its grand strategic promise, effectively neutralizing the aerial threat and paving the way for the liberation of a continent. Yet, as the Allied armies pushed inland toward Berlin, the grim, quiet ledgers back at the air bases in England revealed a human toll so staggering it threatened to eclipse the sheer magnitude of the victory itself. The liberation of Europe was secured, but the price extracted from the American bomber crews was historically unprecedented. Behind the triumphant headlines of shattered German infrastructure and a vanished Luftwaffe lay a ledger of human sacrifice that defies modern comprehension. The United States Army Air Forces fought a relentless war of attritional mathematics, and the men of the mighty 8th paid the absolute steepest toll of any American military unit in the Second World War. By the time the guns fell silent in May 1945, the statistics compiled by the 8th Air Force were staggering. Over 26,000 men belonging to this single command were killed in action. To put this terrifying number into a grim perspective, the 8th Air Force suffered more fatal casualties in the freezing skies of Europe than the entire United States Marine Corps suffered in the brutal, bloody, island-hopping campaigns of the 5 Sieges of the Pacific Theater. Another 28,000 airmen became prisoners of war, shot out of the stratosphere and forced to endure years of starvation and cold in harsh German Stalags. Over 4,000 heavy bombers, marvels of modern engineering, were reduced to twisted, burning aluminum scattered across the European continent. Behind these massive, impersonal numbers were deeply localized tragedies, played out daily across the pastoral landscapes of East Anglia. The rhythm of life on a bomber base was a cruel oscillation between adrenaline-fueled terror and agonizing anticipation. When a mission was scheduled, The deafening roar of Wright's Cyclone engines would shake the English countryside at dawn. Hours later, the ground crews would gather near the control towers, scanning the clouds and counting the specks on the horizon as the surviving formations limped home. They watched for the red flares popping from the cockpits of approaching bombers, the universal emergency signal for dead or heavily wounded men aboard. They watched B-17s touch down with massive chunks of their wings missing, their fuselages riddled with hundreds of jagged shrapnel holes, trailing hydraulic fluid and black smoke. But the heaviest, most suffocating silence was reserved for the aircraft that simply never appeared. Inside the corrugated iron Nissen huts, the aftermath of a deep penetration raid was devastatingly quiet. 10 men might live in a single hut, sharing a small coal stove and the intense bond of combat. On a bad afternoon, like the massacres over Schweinfurt or Munster, 6 or 7 of those bunks might suddenly be empty. There was a rigid, practiced protocol for this loss. Surviving crewmen or supply clerks would quietly enter the barracks and pack away the personal effects of the missing. Letters from home, half-read paperbacks, and civilian clothes were folded into canvas footlockers, sealed, and shipped back to grieving families across the Atlantic. For the men who survived, there was no time to mourn. The brutal logic of the daylight bombing campaign demanded that they fly again the next morning, or the morning after that. They were forced to suppress the trauma, compartmentalize the visceral horror of seeing their friends blown out of the sky, and climb back into the unpressurized aircraft. This relentless psychological pressure birthed a unique form of combat fatigue, quietly referred to by the airmen as being flak happy. Men developed severe tremors, wept uncontrollably in their sleep, or stared blankly into the distance, completely hollowed out by the sheer statistical improbability of surviving a complete combat tour. Yet they continued to fly. The replacements poured in constantly, teenage boys fresh from sunlit flight schools in Texas and Florida, quickly absorbing the hardened, fatalistic stare of the veterans. They stepped into the empty bunks, learned the lethal intricacies of the combat box, and joined the endless stream of bombers pushing eastward. The industrial might of the United States could produce tens of thousands of new flying fortresses, but it was the unbreakable, terrifying endurance of these young men that ultimately allowed the Doctrine to succeed. Their actions dismantled the aerial defenses of a sprawling empire, demanding a final reflection on the nature of this unprecedented mechanized slaughter. The air war over Europe fundamentally rewrote the rules of human conflict. For the first time in history, the destruction of an empire was managed from 5 miles above the earth, waged by young men fighting in an environment entirely hostile to life itself. The strategic daylight bombing campaign was a grim triumph of industrial logistics, driven by terrifying mathematical attrition. To the German defenders, the B-17 combat box was initially a tactical puzzle to be solved, a target to be bled. Luftwaffe pilots executed astonishing feats of aerial gunnery, tearing the American formations apart with heavy rockets and concentrated autocannon fire. They fought with the firm belief that by inflicting unsustainable slaughter, they could break the will of a distant nation. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the war machine rising to meet them. The true power of the mighty 8th Air Force did not lie in the complex optics of the Norden bombsight, nor solely in the heavy aluminum skin of the flying fortress. It was forged in the quiet, terrifying resolve of the men who climbed back into those freezing, unpressurized cabins, morning after morning. The ultimate weapon was the devastating psychological blow dealt to the Axis powers, the chilling realization that no matter how many bombers were shot out of the sky on a Tuesday, an identical, deafening armada would blot out the sun on Wednesday. When the long-range P-51 Mustangs finally arrived to sweep the Luftwaffe from the sky, they tipped the scales of survival. But the foundation of that victory had already been laid in blood. The American bomber boys held the line in the stratosphere during the darkest months of the war, absorbing horrifying losses to stretch the German military apparatus to its absolute breaking point. Today the skies over Europe are quiet, crisscrossed only by the silent white contrails of commercial airliners. Yet, the legacy of the Daylight Campaign remains permanently etched into the history of mechanized warfare. It stands as a profound monument to an era where the fate of the world was decided in the freezing, oxygen-starved margins of the atmosphere, by thousands of young men who simply refused to stop returning